The rain had been falling all night, a steady hiss against the corrugated metal rooftops of the training compound, and in the dim morning light the field still glistened with puddles when Captain Harris told his men to assemble on the range, his voice carrying over the whistle of the wind as if determined to cut through doubt itself, and that was when he singled her out, the woman who had been standing slightly apart from the rest, her rifle slung across her back, her shoulders squared though. Her stomach churned with the pressure of so many eyes judging her, dismissing her before she had even fired a shot, because Harris had already made it clear he believed she wasn't ready, that this was work for hardened veterans, not someone barely 5.5 feet tall with a face that still looked more suited to a university classroom than a battlefield, but she had trained harder than any of them, pushing herself past exhaustion every night, memorizing wind patterns, calculating bullet drop, practicing until her fingers were raw, and though doubt gnawed at her in quiet moments she had promised herself she would never let them see it, not once, because this was the only chance she had to prove she belonged here. The men were lined up along the benches, checking their scopes, murmuring jokes under their breath about whether she would even hit the first target, and Harris paced with that smirk he wore like armor, confident his word was law, confident that when he told command she wasn't ready they would accept it without question. But then the lieutenant who had been watching her progress closely stepped forward, a silent ally, and placed 17 small flags along the perimeter of the range each, marking a steel target that had been set at varying distances, some hidden partially behind barriers, others barely visible through the early morning mist, and he said in a low voice that this would be her trial, no more drills, no more hypotheticals, either she passed or she went home. She took her place at the end of the range, the mud sucking at her boots, and dropped to the ground with her rifle, the cold seeping into her elbows as she settled into prone position, her heartbeat thundering in her ears though her face betrayed nothing, and when she wrapped her hands around the weapon it felt like an extension of herself, the metal familiar, steady, unshakable in a way she wished she could be. Harris barked that she wasn't ready, that this was a waste of time, that no one could hit all 17 in the allotted 4 minutes, and especially not her, but she tuned him out, her world narrowing until it was just the crosshairs and the rhythm of her breathing, the clock ticking down in her mind, every second precious. The first target was 200 meters out, a straightforward shot, but she didn't rush it, she inhaled, let the air burn in her lungs, exhaled slow and squeezed the trigger, the crack of the rifle cutting through the air as the steel rang clear, and she was already shifting before the sound had faded, cycling the bolt, adjusting for the second target at 300 meters, compensating for the wind, the rain, the slight angle of the terrain, and again the steel sang with her bullet's kiss. The men who had been smirking now leaned forward, their laughter dying as they realized she wasn't hesitating, wasn't faltering, her movements fluid, economical, the way only endless practice could teach, and Harris's frown deepened with every shot that landed true. The third and fourth targets went down in quick succession, her body moving like clockwork, her mind calculating faster than she had thought possible, and with each hit her confidence grew, feeding on itself, sharpening her focus. At 600 meters she slowed just a fraction, recalculating for the wind that had picked up, and Harris seized on that, shouting that she was stalling, that the pressure was breaking her. But then the steel rang again and again, the bullet finding its home with unerring precision, and silence fell over the line of men as they watched something they had not expected, something that chipped away at the certainty they had carried with them into this morning. She was halfway through, sweat beading at her temple despite the chill, her fingers moving automatically, feeding the weapon, working the bolt, her eyes scanning for the next flag, the next angle, and time seemed to slow, every second stretching and snapping back like elastic as she counted not just the targets but the seconds she had left, refusing to let panic creep in. At 800 meters the target was half hidden behind a stack of crates slick with rain, and she adjusted her position, steadying her breath, feeling the mud soak into her uniform as she pressed tighter to the ground, ignoring the ache in her shoulders, the bite of the stock against her collarbone, and when she pulled the trigger the bullet threaded the narrow space, striking steel with a resonant clang that made even the lieutenant glance at Harris with the hint of a smile. 9, 10, 11 fell, each shot precise, deliberate, her rhythm unbroken, and though her muscles screamed for relief she pushed them down, feeding on the fire in her chest that said she was not going to be dismissed again, not today. With less than a minute left she locked onto the 12th target, nearly obscured by brush, and squeezed off the shot, clean hit, then swung to the 13th and 14th, faster now, trusting her instincts, letting muscle memory guide her hands, and both targets fell in rapid succession, the onlookers now utterly silent, their disbelief giving way to awe. She could feel the seconds slipping away, the pressure crushing down on her, but it sharpened her rather than breaking her, and when she took aim at the 15th target, a small silhouette perched precariously on a fence post, She didn't allow hesitation, didn't allow doubt, she fired and it fell, the ringing sound carrying across the range like a bell of defiance. 16 was the hardest yet, nearly 900 meters out, the wind gusting unpredictable across the field, the rain coming down harder now, blurring her vision, but she adjusted, recalculated, felt the rifle steady under her grip, and let the shot fly, her breath freezing as the bullet cut through the storm and struck true, the clang echoing like thunder. Only one remained, and she had seconds left, her lungs burning, her arms numb, but her eyes locked onto the final flag, the target small and far, barely visible through the mist, and she squeezed the trigger with everything she had left, the rifle recoiling into her shoulder as the steel sang one last time, 17 hits in under 4 minutes, and when she lowered her weapon at last there was no sound on the range except the fading echo of that final shot. No laughter, no doubt, only the undeniable truth of what she had just done. The silence that followed her final shot was heavier than the storm clouds pressing down over the range, a silence that seemed to press on every chest, to make every man present realize that the line they had drawn between themselves and her had just been obliterated in less than 4 minutes, and though she kept her face expressionless, her eyes cold and steady as she pushed herself back to her feet, inside she could feel the tremor of relief, the surge of vindication because she had known she was capable, but knowing and proving were two very different things. And now the proof lay scattered across the field in the ringing steel of 17 clean kills. Captain Harris's jaw was set so hard it looked like his teeth might crack, his smug certainty drained from his face, yet still he opened his mouth as if to protest, to find some excuse, but no words came because he knew command would hear about this and there was no denying what had happened in front of 24 witnesses. The lieutenant who had set the flag stepped forward, his boots splashing in the mud, his expression unreadable but his voice calm as he announced the time, 3 minutes and 52 seconds, and even the most cynical men among the group couldn't disguise the flicker of awe in their eyes as they looked at her, the woman they had mocked only minutes before. She slung her rifle over her shoulder, her muscles aching, her uniform heavy with rain and dirt, but she stood taller than she had ever stood in her life, taller than the doubts that had haunted her through every sleepless night of training, taller than Harris's voice that had tried to cut her down at every turn. Yet even as she walked back across the range she knew this was only the beginning, because proving herself once did not mean the war was over, it meant expectations would be higher, scrutiny sharper, every mistake magnified, and the battlefield waiting beyond the wire was far more merciless than any training exercise. That night she lay awake in her bunk, the rain still hammering the roof, the smell of oil and sweat clinging to the barracks, and her mind replayed every shot, every adjustment, the way the rifle had felt steady in her hands, but also the look on Harris's face, the cold anger in his eyes that told her he wasn't finished with her, that he would find another way to break her down, because men like him didn't let go of their power easily. She thought of her father, who had been a soldier before her, who had told her stories of nights in the desert where the only friend you had was the scope pressed to your eye, who had died in combat when she was still a girl, leaving behind medals that gleamed but couldn't keep the family warm, and she remembered the vow she had made standing by his grave that she would carry the rifle better than anyone else, that she would make every shot count, because she understood what it meant to take a life and what it meant to save one. Morning came harsh and early, the whistle dragging them out of their bunks, and she moved with the others to the mess hall, ignoring the whispers that now followed her, no longer mocking but tinged with curiosity, respect, even envy, and when Harris walked in his glare swept the room like a blade, daring anyone to mention the trial, daring anyone to acknowledge that the girl he had written off had shattered every doubt in less than 4 minutes. Training intensified over the next weeks, long marches with heavy packs, endless drills in the mud and rain, weapons maintenance until fingers bled, and she bore it all without complaint, her body pushed to the edge, her will hardening with every test, while at night she cleaned her rifle and studied maps, wind charts, enemy profiles, anything that might give her an edge when the real missions began. The lieutenant, whose name she now knew as Daniels, occasionally lingered after drills, offering quiet corrections, rare words of advice, never condescending, and she realized he was watching not just her aim but her discipline, her resolve, as if he were weighing whether she was ready for something more. The day came when command summoned her to the briefing room, a space thick with cigarette smoke and tension, maps pinned across the walls, photographs of known insurgents spread across the table, and they told her bluntly that her trial had been only a precursor, that a mission awaited which required the kind of precision few could manage, a mission that would put her in hostile territory with only a spotter at her side, a mission where failure meant not embarrassment but death for her and the men depending on her. She listened without flinching, nodding once because this was what she had been waiting for, this was why she had endured the humiliation, the long nights, the doubt, because the rifle was not for proving points on a range, it was for shaping battles, for tilting the scales when the odds were impossible. Harris objected, of course, his voice rising sharp with protest, claiming she was untested in real combat, that they couldn't gamble lives on some miracle shot, but Daniels cut him off with a look that silenced the room, reminding them that she had done what none of them had believed possible, and that courage under pressure was the truest measure of readiness. When the briefing ended, she walked out with the mission folder clutched in her hands, her pulse hammering, not from fear but from the weight of the task ahead, and as she returned to her bunk she felt the eyes of the others on her, some still doubtful, some begrudging, but many filled with a respect she had never known before. That night she read every page of the folder by the light of a single bulb, memorizing every face, every coordinate, every contingency, and when she finally lay back she whispered a promise into the dark, a promise that when the time came, no one would ever again dare say she wasn't ready. The convoy moved out before dawn, engines growling low as the trucks rumbled over uneven dirt roads that wound through mountains cloaked in fog, and she sat in the back with her gear strapped tight, the weight of her rifle across her knees a steady reminder of why she was there, her eyes scanning the shifting silhouettes of ridges and treelines, every shadow a potential threat, every turn a possible ambush, and though the men around her whispered nervously, adjusting straps and checking weapons, she remained still, her breathing calm, her mind already rehearsing the mission she had memorized down to the smallest detail, because she knew hesitation would be death once they crossed into the kill zone. Daniels was beside her, silent as always, his presence steady, his eyes sharp under the brim of his helmet as he studied her the way a spotter should, not just watching her movements but measuring her readiness, and when he finally spoke it was only a quiet reminder to trust the work she had put in, to let the rifle do its part, and she nodded once without looking at him because words were wasted now, the time for doubt long past. By the time the convoy reached the forward base the sun had risen but offered no warmth, the air thin and biting at this altitude, the peaks jagged against a sky the color of steel, and she could feel in her bones that this place was not meant for comfort, it was meant for survival, for the clash of wills that left one side buried in the dirt. They disembarked quickly, soldiers scattering to unload supplies and secure the perimeter, and Daniels led her straight to the briefing tent where a map was spread across a battered table, pins marking suspected enemy positions, photographs showing a cluster of buildings tucked into a valley where intelligence claimed a high-value target would appear within the next 24 hours, a commander who had orchestrated countless ambushes, who moved like a ghost and left trails of bodies behind him, and the task was simple in words but brutal in reality. She was to take the shot, end his reign, and give their forces the opening they needed to push deeper into contested ground. Harris was there too, of course, his face sour as if he had swallowed something rotten, and he wasted no time voicing his contempt, insisting that giving such a responsibility to someone untested in live combat was madness, that Daniels was gambling with lives, but Daniels countered with steel in his voice, pointing out that sometimes untested meant unbroken, that she had not been dulled by failure or arrogance, and the room fell silent when command reminded Harris that his opinion was noted, but irrelevant because the order had been signed. She listened without flinching, committing every landmark and coordinate to memory, already calculating angles and distances in her mind, imagining how the wind would cut through the valley, how the sun would shift shadows across the targets, and by the time the briefing ended she was no longer nervous, she was steady, because she had trained for this moment since before she wore the uniform, since the nights she had whispered promises to her father's memory, and she knew that tomorrow she would either prove herself beyond all question or vanish into the silence of failure. That night at the base she cleaned her rifle with meticulous care, every piece oiled, every mechanism checked twice, her hands moving with the same precision she demanded from her shots, and Daniel sat across from her, scribbling notes in a worn notebook, occasionally glancing up as if to say something but then choosing silence instead, until finally he broke it with a single question, asking if she was afraid, and she paused only a moment before answering that fear was always there but discipline was stronger, and he gave a small nod as if that was the only answer worth hearing. Sleep came late and shallow, filled with flashes of memory and imagined futures, and when the alarm dragged her awake before dawn she rose without hesitation, pulling on her gear, tightening straps, securing the rifle against her shoulder as though it were a part of her body, and then she and Daniel slipped out of the compound into the cold pre-dawn dark, moving on foot toward the ridge that overlooked the valley. The climb was brutal, the terrain slick with frost, rocks shifting underfoot, the weight of gear grinding into muscle, but she kept her pace steady, each breath a puff of mist in the freezing air, and Daniels behind her matched her step for step without a word, until at last they crested the ridge and the valley spread before them, bleak and wide, the cluster of buildings barely visible through the thin veil of fog that still clung to the ground. They found their position quickly, a small rise shielded by boulders, perfect for concealment, and she lay prone on the cold stone, unfolding the bipod, settling the rifle into place, her cheek pressed against the stock as she peered through the scope, adjusting the dials until every detail sharpened, every shadow became a line she could trace. Hours passed like this, silence broken only by the whisper of wind and the occasional murmur from Daniels as he checked the rangefinder, adjusted bearings, kept watch for movement, and though her muscles ached from stillness she did not shift, did not allow the discomfort to weaken her focus, because patience was part of the hunt, patience separated the living from the dead in the world of snipers. At last movement stirred below, figures emerging from the buildings, armed men scanning the perimeter, and she tracked them through the scope, cataloging weapons, noting patrol patterns, searching for the one face she had memorized from photographs, the commander whose death would shift the tide. Time crawled as shadows lengthened and shortened, as the sun burned away the fog and the valley came into stark relief, every roof, every alley exposed, and with each hour that passed her focus sharpened until the world beyond the scope ceased to exist, until the only thing that mattered was the rifle steady under her hands and the knowledge that when the target appeared she would have only one chance. When Daniels finally whispered that he had eyes on the commander stepping into view, her pulse spiked but her hands remained steady, the crosshairs settling over the man's chest as he strode from the largest building, surrounded by guards, his presence unmistakable, and she exhaled slow, blocking out everything else, readying herself for the shot that would define her. Her finger tightened on the trigger as the crosshairs locked over the commander's chest, the world narrowing into that single heartbeat of stillness before the storm, every sound fading except the rush of her own pulse, and she exhaled slow, steady, squeezing with the patience of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, until the rifle cracked and the recoil slammed into her shoulder, the shot tearing through the silence of the ridge and racing down into the valley where it struck home with brutal precision, the target dropping instantly, his guards scattering in panic, shouting and pointing wildly as confusion tore through their ranks, but before the echo had even faded she was cycling the bolt, adjusting, lining up the next threat, her movements smooth and relentless, because she knew that killing the commander was only the beginning, that the men around him would try to rally, would search for the shooter, and she couldn't afford to let them regroup. Daniels was at her side calling distances, his voice clipped and steady, and she responded with flawless rhythm, her rifle cracking again and again, each bullet finding its mark, each target falling before they could even aim, until the valley was chaos, armed men diving for cover, trucks revving as some tried to flee, muzzle flashes sparking wildly but with no accuracy, no discipline, because they didn't know where death was coming from. She adjusted for wind, for distance, for the shift of shadows, her body moving without hesitation, 17 seconds yielding 4 more kills, her mind cold and clear, and the soldiers back at the base miles away would never know that the tide of this battle was being decided here on this ridge by a woman Harris had sworn wasn't ready. Her breath fogged against the stock, sweat mixing with the chill as she lined up another shot, and Daniels murmured 2 o'clock rooftop 650 meters, and she swung smoothly, the crosshairs cutting across the valley until the figure snapped into view, a man lifting a radio to his mouth, and she dropped him before the words could leave his throat, then shifted again, faster, harder, her body aching but her will unbroken. The enemy had begun firing blindly toward the ridge, bullets tearing into rocks, shards of stone spraying over her helmet, but she didn't flinch, didn't break because they couldn't see her, couldn't touch her, not while her breathing held steady and her focus stayed sharp. More figures spilled from the buildings, scrambling for trucks, and Daniels called them out one by one, his rangefinder working in tandem with her rifle, until the ground around the vehicles was littered with bodies, engines silenced by her bullets before they could roar to life. Time stretched and blurred, seconds feeling like hours as the valley became a slaughter ground, each shot deliberate, each kill decisive, and though the enemy fired endlessly their desperation betrayed them, their bullets wasted, their fear mounting with every man who fell unseen. She shifted her scope to the far ridge where movement flickered, a small squad circling wide, trying to flank, and she picked them off one by one, her shots surgical, her precision terrifying, until even Daniels muttered low under his breath in awe, because what they were witnessing was no longer a question of readiness but a display of mastery, of dominance, the kind that rewrote reputations in blood and fire. At some point Harris's voice crackled through the radio at Daniels, demanding updates, demanding to know if the mission was compromised, and Daniels replied flatly that the mission was not only successful but decisive, his tone carrying the weight of proof that could not be argued, while she ignored the chatter entirely, too locked into the rhythm of her shots to waste energy on politics. The commander's body still lay sprawled in the dirt below, the men who had once followed him now reduced to panic and disarray, and though part of her felt the gravity of what she had done, the greater part knew there was no room for reflection yet, only survival, only the work of finishing what had begun with that first bullet. Minutes passed and the valley grew quiet, smoke curling from burned-out vehicles, the bodies of men scattered across mud and stone, and she scanned carefully through the scope for any lingering movement, any sign of regrouping, but all she saw were stragglers fleeing into the treeline, too far and too fast for pursuit, their courage broken, their leader gone. Slowly she lowered the rifle, her arms trembling with the release of tension, her breath ragged though controlled, and Daniels gave a single nod beside her, the smallest gesture of acknowledgement but heavier than any words, because he had seen it all, had measured her under fire, and knew there could be no denying her place now. They waited another hour on the ridge, watching, ensuring no counterattack came, the air cold against their sweat-soaked uniforms, the weight of what they had done settling like stone in their bones, until finally Daniels signaled to pack up, and they slipped back into the jagged terrain, moving swift and silent toward the extraction point. The hike down was grueling, her body aching, adrenaline fading into exhaustion, but each step was lighter than it should have been because the burden she had carried for so long, the burden of proving herself, had been lifted in that valley, washed clean by steel and blood. By the time they reached the base the sun was setting, painting the peaks in fire, and soldiers rushed to meet them, whispers already spreading of what had happened, of the ghost on the ridge who had rained death in under 4 minutes, and she walked through their stairs with her rifle slung across her back, her chin high, her heart steady. Inside the command tent Harris waited, his expression thunderous, his pride shattered but his stubbornness unbroken, and he spat accusations about luck, about inflated reports, but Daniels cut him down with a cold summary of the mission, every detail logged, every kill confirmed, and command listened, their eyes shifting between Harris's fury and her calm presence, until it was clear whose words carried truth. When it was over she returned to her bunk, stripped the mud from her gear, cleaned her rifle until the metal gleamed, and lay back on her cot staring at the ceiling, the roar of the battle still echoing in her ears, knowing this was not the end but only the beginning, because now the world had seen what she could do, and the battles ahead would be harder, bloodier, the stakes higher, but she also knew one thing with absolute certainty, that no one would ever again dare say she wasn't ready. Sleep did not come easily that night even though her body screamed for rest, because every time she closed her eyes she saw the valley again, the smoke rising, the commander's body crumpled in the dirt, the sudden jerks of men as her bullets found them, and though she had been trained to process the weight of killing, no amount of drills could fully prepare the mind for the reality of ending lives with such precision. 17 men silenced in less than 4 minutes, each shot perfect, each shot final, and she lay staring at the dark ceiling of the barracks listening to the slow breathing of other soldiers while her mind replayed every detail as if testing her, asking her whether she could do it again if she had to, and she whispered to herself that she could, that she must, because war did not pause for conscience, it demanded action, and those who faltered paid with more than their own lives. By morning her body had recovered enough to mask the exhaustion, and she moved through the base with quiet determination, ignoring the sidelong glances that followed her, the hushed voices that spoke her name with a mix of awe and unease, because news of what she had done on the ridge had already spread, whispered from man to man, reshaping her from an outsider into a figure both respected and feared. Harris, however, was not finished, and when she entered the mess hall she found him seated with a group of loyalists, his eyes narrowing as he made some loud remark about accidents happening in combat zones, about green soldiers getting lucky once and then dying the next day, his voice carrying enough for her to hear, but she refused to rise to it, refused to give him the satisfaction, because she knew now that his words were weapons of desperation, dulled and useless compared to the cold truth of what she had proven. Daniels remained close but unobtrusive, always watching, always measuring, and when command summoned them to another briefing he walked beside her, silent until they were alone, and then he told her quietly that she should prepare for the next mission to be harder, bloodier, because once the enemy realized what had happened in that valley they would not make the same mistake twice, they would be hunting her as much as she was hunting them. In the briefing tent maps were spread again, fresh photographs pinned to corkboard, this time of a fortified compound nestled deep in rugged terrain, bristling with armed guards, intelligence marking it as both a supply hub and a command post, and the order was direct. She and Daniels were to infiltrate the mountains, establish a position, and cripple the chain of command by eliminating 3 high-value officers scheduled to gather there within the week. Harris raised objections as expected, his voice sharp with scorn, but command barely acknowledged him now, their attention fixed on her, on the woman who had shattered expectations, and she listened with unwavering focus, committing every detail to memory, already mapping angles in her mind, already envisioning how she would line up each shot. The mission preparations began immediately, long treks across the base with weighted packs, nights spent practicing calculations under low light, days spent studying weather patterns that might shift the air currents through the narrow valleys, and she accepted it all without complaint, knowing that discipline was the only shield she had against both failure and doubt. On the eve of departure she sat alone on the edge of the base wall, staring out at the jagged mountains silhouetted against the fading sun, her rifle across her knees, and she thought of her father again, of the lessons he had tried to teach her before war had taken him, of the pride he might have felt if he could see her now carrying a burden heavier than metals, a burden measured in lives. Daniels approached quietly, his presence more reassuring than words, and after a long silence he told her that sometimes the most dangerous thing a sniper carried was not the rifle but the memory of the people they had killed, because memory could weigh more than steel, and she nodded, not because she fully understood yet but because she sensed he was right, and that time would teach her the cost. They departed at dawn, packs heavy, rifles secured, boots crunching over gravel as they left the relative safety of the base behind and disappeared into the wilderness where the enemy held the advantage, and the climb was harder this time, the paths narrower, the air thinner, every muscle in her body screaming under the relentless weight, but she pressed forward without falter, every step fueled by the knowledge that the mission depended on her steadiness. 4 days they moved like shadows through canyons and ridges, setting up temporary hides, observing, recording, waiting because patience was the sniper's greatest weapon. And when at last the compound came into view it was everything the intelligence had promised. Walls of stone reinforced with steel, guard towers at every corner, men patrolling in disciplined rotations, and at the heart of it all the building where the officers were expected to gather. They established their position on a cliffside nearly a kilometer away, camouflaging themselves among jagged rocks, their rifles laid across the stone, their scopes trained on the compound, and she felt the old calm settle over her. The stillness that came when the world narrowed to crosshairs and breath, but this time it was different, because now she knew the enemy would be ready, would be searching the ridges for any sign of her, and that every shot had to be not just perfect but invisible. Hours bled into days as they watched, sleeping in shifts, eating cold rations, enduring the bite of wind and the ache of unmoving muscles, until finally the moment came, the convoy arriving in a swirl of dust, armored vehicles grinding to a halt as officers stepped out, their presence unmistakable through the lenses, their gestures commanding, their guards attentive, and Daniels whispered the ranges with the same calm certainty as before while she adjusted her scope, her finger steady on the trigger, her breath controlled. The first officer came into her sights, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, and she exhaled as the rifle cracked, the bullet crossing the distance in a blink to drop him instantly, chaos erupting in the compound below, and already she was shifting, lining up the second, another clean kill, the crack of her rifle echoing like thunder over the cliffs, and the guards were scrambling now, shouting, firing into the rocks, their bullets scattering stone chips over her helmet, but she did not flinch, did not falter, her focus absolute. The third officer ducked behind a vehicle, shielded by men who fired wildly into the ridges, but she waited, calm, patient, her finger poised, until he made the mistake of lifting his head, and then the rifle roared again, the shot clean, decisive, and the compound dissolved into chaos as their leadership was shattered in seconds. Daniels called targets as they moved, urging her to conserve rounds, but the rhythm had taken her again, the storm of calm precision that made her unstoppable, and though she knew extraction would be dangerous she also knew they had already accomplished what they came for, the enemy crippled, their chain of command broken. As they packed quickly and slipped back into the mountains she felt the same fire that had burned on the ridge, the fire that whispered she was not just proving herself anymore, she was rewriting what anyone thought possible, and though Harris would never admit it she knew that every man in that base, and perhaps even the enemy themselves, would carry her name like a shadow. The escape through the mountains after the compound strike was a test harsher than any range, harsher even than the moment. She first pulled the trigger on a live enemy, because the enemy was furious now, their radios alive with shouts, their patrols surging into the ridges, their dogs sniffing at the cold ground while searchlights swept the cliffs like knives of white fire, and she and Daniels had to move with absolute silence, crawling on their bellies across gravel, pressing themselves into shadows, waiting breathless as squads passed within meters, their boots crunching only feet away, the air stinking of sweat and gun oil, the tension so thick it felt like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The weight of her rifle dug into her shoulder like a brand, reminding her that it was both her weapon and her curse, the thing that had given her purpose and now painted a target on her back larger than any rank could, and she forced herself to think not of fear but of steps, of breaths, of calculations that reduced terror to mathematics, because that was the sniper's way, to break chaos into angles and ranges and probabilities, to turn panic into a puzzle that could be solved with patience. Daniels moved ahead, guiding them through narrow goat paths, pausing often to study the stars for bearings or crouch low to listen, and she trusted him implicitly, their bond forged in silence and fire, his steadiness the counterweight to the storm that burned in her veins when the rifle roared. Hours stretched into a day into two, their rations dwindling, their bodies aching from the cold and the endless climbs, but neither complained, because complaint was wasted breath, and on the third night they finally reached the rendezvous, a ravine marked only by a bent tree and a pile of weathered stones, where a helicopter was scheduled to extract them under cover of darkness. Yet when they arrived the ravine was empty, silent except for the hiss of wind, and Daniels muttered a curse under his breath as he scanned the horizon with his scope, realizing what she already suspected. The enemy had intercepted their signals, the extraction compromised, the sky above them watched by hostile eyes. They waited anyway, hours passing in suffocating silence, until at last the distant thrum of rotor blades reached their ears, but almost instantly it was answered by tracer fire cutting the sky, green arcs streaking like lightning as anti-aircraft guns opened up from the valley, and the helicopter veered off, engines screaming as it pulled away, leaving them stranded. Daniels turned to her then, his face grim but composed, and told her this was where skill ended and endurance began, that they would have to move deeper into enemy territory to circle back toward friendly lines, a journey that could take days or weeks, and that if she was not prepared she should speak now. She said nothing, only checked the bolt of her rifle, chambered around, and met his gaze until he nodded, because words meant little out here, only resolve mattered, and hers burned hotter than ever. The trek that followed was a blur of exhaustion and instinct, crossing rivers waist-deep in icy water, scaling cliffs with hands numb from cold, sleeping only in snatches beneath rocks while rain lashed them raw, always listening for the distant shouts of patrols or the crack of gunfire that would mean discovery, and more than once they narrowly escaped ambushes, the enemy tightening their net, convinced that the ghost sniper who had shattered their command must still be somewhere in the mountains. On the fifth day hunger gnawed at her belly with claws sharper than fear, their rations gone, and they were forced to steal what they could from enemy camps, slipping in at night like shadows, cutting throats of sentries in silence, taking bread and water before vanishing again into the dark, and though killing at range had been her world until now, she discovered that death up close was a different beast, one that stank of blood and breath and trembling hands, and yet she did it without hesitation, because hesitation meant capture, and capture meant torture and execution, and Daniel's nod afterward told her he understood that she had crossed another threshold. On the seventh night they reached a ridge that overlooked a valley crawling with enemy forces, dozens of trucks and tents sprawled like insects beneath the moon, and Daniels whispered that they could not cross without causing a diversion, that if they tried to sneak through they would be caught, and she studied the scene through her scope until she found what she needed. A fuel truck parked at the edge of the camp, poorly guarded, its tank glinting faintly in the moonlight, a target too tempting to ignore. Without hesitation she lined up the shot, compensating for distance and wind, and when she fired the bullet sparked against metal and the truck erupted in a fireball that tore the night apart, flames consuming tents, men screaming, chaos ripping through the camp as soldiers scrambled to fight a threat they could not see, and in that chaos she and Daniel slipped past, their bodies low, their breaths ragged, their hearts hammering but their path clear. 4 hours they moved through smoke and fire, the night alive with gunfire and shouts, until the valley was far behind them and silence returned, broken only by the pounding of their feet and the rasp of their breaths. By dawn they collapsed behind a ridge, too exhausted to move, their bodies caked in ash and sweat, but still alive, still moving, still defying the death that hunted them. She lay staring at the sky, pale and cold above, and realized that something inside her had shifted again, that she was no longer simply the sniper proving herself but the weapon that enemy generals cursed in their tents, the ghost in the ridges who turned battles into chaos. And though the weight of that role was immense it also filled her with a grim pride, because she had not just survived, she had become indispensable. Daniels, his voice hoarse, told her they were only 2 days from the river that marked the border of friendly territory, that if they could make it across they would be safe, and she nodded, her body broken but her will unyielding, because she had endured too much to falter now. As they rose and began the final march, she tightened her grip on her rifle and whispered to herself again, the same words she had whispered in every trial and every battle. That no one, not Harris, not the enemy, not even her own doubts, would ever again say she wasn't ready. The final march toward the river was less a journey than a crucible, every step wrung from bodies that had nothing left to give, every breath torn from lungs scarred by smoke and exhaustion, and yet she and Daniels pushed on, driven by nothing but the knowledge that to stop was to die, to falter was to be swallowed by the endless patrols still hunting them, the mountains echoing with the shouts of men who would not rest until the ghost sniper and her shadow were caught or killed. The river was salvation, but salvation lay across miles of hostile ground, and the enemy had tightened their cordon, checkpoints sprouting on ridges, drones buzzing overhead, dogs prowling the valleys, and it seemed that every time they turned a corner, death was waiting with rifle barrels and searchlights. Twice they narrowly escaped, once when a squad stumbled across their tracks and forced them into a running climb up a sheer rock face where bullets sparked against stone inches from their legs, and once when a drone's camera swept low, its whine sharp in the night, only for her to fire a single shot that shattered its lens before it could send coordinates, the drone tumbling like a broken bird into the ravine. Each escape cost them strength, but each survival hardened her resolve, the fear that had once gnawed at her replaced by a clarity she had never known, a focus so sharp it seemed to pierce through pain and fatigue alike, leaving only the mission, only the next step, only the certainty that she would not allow failure. On the 10th day since the compound strike, they finally reached a bluff overlooking the river, its waters gleaming silver under the moon, wide and fast with jagged rocks jutting from the current like teeth, and on the far side stretched the promise of friendly lines, a promise so close it almost hurt to see, yet between them and freedom sprawled an entrenched enemy outpost, sandbags and bunkers lining the shore, machine guns mounted to sweep the banks, patrol boats tied to docks and men moving with the discipline of those expecting an attack. Daniels cursed softly, his jaw tight, and said they could not cross here without being torn apart, that the current alone might kill them even without the guns, but she studied the scene through her scope and saw possibilities where he saw only walls, because that was the sniper's gift, to find cracks in the unbreakable, to see the shot no one else dared imagine. She traced the arcs of the patrols, counted the rotations of the spotlights, watched the pauses in the gunner's sweeps, and in her mind the chaos unfolded, a sequence of shots and moves, each flowing into the next, a deadly dance with no margin for error, and she told Daniels there was a way, that she could clear a path if he trusted her. He hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding, because trust between them had been forged too deep for doubt, and so they prepared, checking weapons, steadying breaths, waiting for the perfect alignment of chance and shadow. When it came she fired, her rifle cracking like thunder as the first machine gunner dropped, his body slumping against the sandbags, and before the echoes faded she was already shifting, firing again, another guard collapsing with a hole between his eyes, then another, each shot precise, each shot final, until panic rippled through the outpost, men shouting, lights swinging wildly, and in that chaos Daniels lit the diversion charges he had carried since the compound, flinging them into the brush behind, explosions ripping the night and drawing enemy eyes away from the river. She kept firing, her body an extension of the rifle, her mind a machine of calculation. 17 shots in under 4 minutes, 17 men silenced before they could return fire, their comrades stumbling in confusion, and in that window of madness she and Daniels sprinted for the shore, boots pounding dirt, lungs burning, bullets hissing past as the survivors finally realized where the real threat was. They plunged into the river without hesitation, the cold biting like knives, the current dragging them under, but they fought through with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose, clawing at the water, kicking against the pole, their heads breaking the surface only to be shoved down again by waves, and still she clung to her rifle, refusing to let go, because without it she was not herself, because it was her life as much as her lungs were, and somehow they made it across, dragged themselves onto the far bank, coughing, shivering, half dead but alive. Alive and over the line where friendly scouts emerged from the brush with rifles raised before lowering them in recognition. Relief was a weight as heavy as exhaustion, crushing her to the ground, tears stinging her eyes though she did not let them fall, because snipers did not cry, not here, not now, but in her chest something broke open, not weakness but release, the realization that she had survived what should have killed her a dozen times, that she had silenced every voice that had ever told her she was not ready. Daniels, soaked and bleeding from a cut on his arm, gave her a look that needed no words, a look that carried pride, respect, and the unspoken acknowledgement that she had not only proven herself but surpassed every expectation, his included. The scouts hurried them to safety, to tents where medics fussed and commanders asked questions, but she answered little, her thoughts still on the river, on the men she had cut down in the night, on the fire and the chaos she had unleashed with her hands steady and her heart unflinching. And she knew that while others would call her a hero or a legend, she was simply what she had always been training to become, ready. The debrief stretched into hours, Commanders dissecting every detail, analysts replaying the fragments of drone footage and intercepted comms, but through it all she sat silent, her body patched with bandages, her rifle leaning against the wall beside her like a loyal hound, her eyes distant as if she were still on that ridge, still hearing the crack of each shot, still feeling the recoil echo down her bones, and when they finally dismissed her she did not feel like a woman who had won, only one who had survived, which in its own way was victory enough. In the weeks that followed she and Daniels were held in secure quarters, monitored, tested, questioned, yet always treated with a quiet reverence, as if the brass knew they were in the presence of something rare, something forged in fire that could not be replicated. Word spread faster than any official report could contain, whispers of the female sniper who had erased 17 men in under 4 minutes, who had crossed a river under fire and come out the other side, whispers that carried through the ranks like gospel until her name was spoken with awe in mess halls and training yards alike, recruits tracing her steps with hungry eyes, veterans nodding in respect they rarely gave. Daniels teased her once, calling her a legend already, but she only shook her head because she knew legends were stories and she was still flesh, still haunted by the faces of those she had taken, the echoes of their final breaths lingering in the back of her skull, yet if the weight of it pressed heavy, she bore it without flinching, because she had chosen this path, because readiness was not about the absence of fear or guilt but the mastery of it. Her superiors offered medals, commendations, even a place in the training cadre where she could pass on her skill to others, and though the temptation of rest tugged at her, though part of her longed to lay the rifle down and step back into a world without constant death at her fingertips, she refused, because to her the rifle was not only a weapon but a promise, and promises could not be abandoned. Missions came again soon enough, each one more dangerous than the last, and each time they called her in with that same measured caution, as if they were testing not only her ability but her willingness, and each time she answered by doing what others thought impossible, until her reputation was no longer just rumor but record, inked into the annals of operations where commanders read her name with relief, knowing the mission had a chance because she was on it. Daniels stayed at her side, their bond deepened beyond words, a trust sealed in fire, and while others rotated out, burned out, or bowed out, the two of them remained, shadows moving through shadows, a team that no enemy wanted to hear whispering in the dark. Still, in rare quiet moments, when the night was still and the weight of war receded for a breath, she thought back to that first day when her commander had looked her in the eye and said she wasn't ready, thought back to the sting of doubt that had lit a fire in her veins, and she realized now that readiness had never been about his judgment, nor even her own, but about the proving ground of reality, about standing in the crucible of life and death and not breaking. That was the truth she carried, the truth that no medal or story could capture, the truth that was hers alone. On a cold dawn months later, as she prepared once more to move out into another hostile land, Daniels asked her if she ever tired of it, if she ever wished to lay it down and be free of it all, and she gave him the only honest answer she had, no. Because this was not a burden she carried unwillingly but a mantle she had claimed, a testament to all the years of being told she could not, should not, would not, and proving with each shot, each mission, each breath that she could, that she did, that she always would. She walked into the next war with her rifle steady, her gaze sharp, her heart unflinching, and behind her trailed the unshakable truth that she had carved into the world with 17 shots across 4 minutes of fire. She had been ready all along, and nothing, no doubt, no enemy, no shadow could ever take that away. The end.